It's so hard Sunday mornings when it's such a really long commute to church. We're in Tel Dan. This is the start. This is where the Jordan comes from. Jordan, from Dan. And there's 3 streams that feed the Jordan. One is the Hebron, and then the Dan is in the middle. And then I can't remember the other one.
Finally, they wanted to live here. It's very obvious why you want to live here. You have water in this land, you have everything. You have vegetation, you have animals. It's very easy to make your living here. And think about what we discovered and explored during our stay in Jerusalem. You remember we used to take you out of Jerusalem to different directions, like east to the Dead Sea. What kind of landscape you saw there? Very different from what we can observe.
It's nice and cold, comparatively.
Just up north here in Dan, the very northern part of Israel. It's like tropical and a whole different climate. It's very wet. We saw amazing farmland coming in, and it's like, wow, this really is the promised land. It got so dark. We're like surrounded by vegetation.
Oh, I feel like this is the Northwest. I love it. It's cool.
It's cool. It's moist.
Oh, beautiful. I would live here.
I've
never said that
green.
about any spot in Israel yet.
The first mention in botanical species in the Bible. Have you noticed? In the Bible we have a lot of botanics, right? We have a lot of different species of vegetation because people they lived in the context of their land, in the context of their nature, right? But the first mention in botanical species in the Bible is a fig tree. In which story you found it? You find it in the story of Adam and Eve. That's right. At the moment they ate from the apple, right?
Guys, I'm gonna need a few more.
We're not supposed to disturb nature here. We have to yeah, look at Joel, what he's doing right now. No. Stay here. Let us see. What kind of power can curse the tree that was especially blessed by God? Only equal power. So that's probably how we can interpret the story when Jesus revealed God's power when he cursed the tree that was especially blessed by God. Because only God that blessed this tree could curse this tree. So, and that's another example how Jesus spoke cultural language of the people. But if you don't know the culture of the people that were in audience and were listeners of Jesus, you don't really appreciate it. So this is one of the things about the fig tree. And here fig tree in the Bible, but it's very sticky sometimes, but we do use it with the real milk. If you milk your goat, for example, or cow, and you can stir such kind of branch with a lot of salt over here, and that's what curdles the milk and produces cheese. So it could be used, and actually this salt chemically has this characteristic that curdles the milk and produces cheese. So you can use it for a milk, but when they say milk and honey, it's a metaphor for the same pinnacle of the prosperity of the land. And again, the land is described as a land of wheat and barley, like basic food, olives, grapes, pomegranates, and the pinnacle of the prosperity, they're figs and dates. And we associate them with milk and honey, because that's what we have from figs, and honey we have from dates. Although it's not a bee honey, as it sounds in the English language, it's a date syrup, in fact. So the expression of the land of milk and
So the land flowing with milk and honey isn't literal milk. It is the milk of a fig tree. And they can actually use this in milk to start the culture for cheese.
Curdling. And then the the figs that it creates can be squeezed out for
the literal translation that our Bible translates into honey is the syrup of the date, and not bee honey, but they get something like honey out of dates. So milk and honey grows in the most, is referencing the most fertile, prosperous land, which is dates and figs, milk and honey. Wow.
And where is Dan? On the map it's right here. That's how Jeroboam marked his northern border, and that's where we are right now. Because this cult center was established from 9th century BC, according to the archaeological resource. And this is the time of Jeroboam. He was the first one who brought this cult up to here. And let us continue to read. And this scene became a scene. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. Very nice expression, like additional thing, as far as Dan.
So up here in Dan, actually at a site of ancient pagan worship from like the 9th century. We learned that the Danites originally were given a territory as a tribe of Israel down near Tel Aviv, but they rejected that territory because they couldn't conquer the enemies there, and they renegotiated with Joshua to move up here. And then later, when the two kingdoms split, northern and southern kingdom, Jeroboam made his own temple and his own form of worship, so the people didn't have to go down to Jerusalem to worship God, and established this place as a place of worship, a place of false worship, where they worshipped. He set up 2 golden calves on this high place behind me, and became a center of false worship and convenience and political control rather than true worship of God. And ultimately all those compromises and steps led to the destruction of the northern kingdom. And Jeroboam said, "It is too much for you to go down to Jerusalem. Here, I built this place for you." He created his own festivals, establishes his own priests, and turned the people away from God. We're on a 2,800-year-old road up this hill. Pretty good shape. An entrance to the city. This was a big city. Lots went on here.
So this one only from 60 years ago, let's say roughly, even less, 60 years ago. And when they came here for the first time, they didn't see all of this. All of this was underground. And here you can understand it very easily. If you look at that slope, if you look at the flat area of the tell, and with your imagination you understand that all of this was covered by the diagonal slope down to our position. So when they came here for the first time, from this particular wall, for example, they found only 1 or 2 courses, upper courses of stones, and they all were covered by vegetation, but not by the ground. And that's why they differ in their color. Can you see the black stone? They're only on the top. All of the rest that has kind of reddish color, right? It's all was kept underground. That's why it doesn't have this black, what we call patina. It's like oxidation of all of the materials, all of the minerals in the stone. So all of this used to be below the ground.
So this is an original gate before Dan of Lystra. Lavish, and this dates back to the time of Abraham, and this is possibly the route that Abraham would have come into the land, so it's also known as Abraham's Gate because he may have come through this gate. So this is dating back, the oldest thing we'll see, to 18th century, so pushing 3,000 years old, this thing. No, almost 4,000 years old.
I think about in John 4, when the guy comes and pleads with Jesus for his child. Jesus doesn't make light of his suffering, but he does point him to a bigger picture. And so I encourage you, as we move into this phase 5, and we're pretty deep into it now, it's August 29 AD and early April.
Hoje tinha toda essa história que está registrada no livro pagã.
Caesarea Philippi.
This picture gives you very good imagination how the place looked like then.
No kidding.
Wow. So try to imagine and to orientate yourself where we are. The followers of the disciples, because that's to where they're going to go finally, right? They're not going to be with the Jews. Finally, they will go to the rest of the nations to bring this idea of the new belief. So it's a part of their preparation here. So have a look, take some pictures, and from here we are going to descend by different staircase.
So this is the site of the ancient god Pan, half goat, half man. Terrible, evil forms of worship. Baby sacrifices, all kinds of awful, awful things. But here in Caesarea Philippi is also the place where Jesus brought his disciples and where they exchanged between Jesus and Peter about who people thought Jesus was, and Peter exclaimed, "You are the Messiah, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "Blessed are you, because God has revealed this to you." And then he says, and you are Peter. His name was Simon. Peter means rock. And he said, "And on this rock I will build my church." And there's a couple interpretations for that. Maybe Jesus meant both things. But on Peter would become the center of the church. And also, because he follows that by, "And the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Right here was known as like the most hellish place in the world, where the worst things happened and the birth of an evil god. So when he says the gates of hell will not prevail, on this rock I will build my church, you can imagine gates are defensive, they're not offensive, and that Jesus is saying there's nowhere that my church will stand, and there's nowhere my church will not go to bring the gospel, to bring salvation, even to the very gates of hell. And there's so much here. This is an amazing place, a horrible place, but Jesus redeemed in a way by calling Peter out to something greater. We just had lunch at this Lebanese restaurant.
Hi, Gary.
Thinking of Gary Witherall. We're really close to Lebanon right now. We're not going to get to cross the border.
You should be thinking of Alan Ann Penner.
Thinking of Alan Ann too.
Alan Ann, thinking of you.
But we had a Lebanese falafel, and I had a Lebanese falafel burger. Not bad.
And this is one of 4 Druze villages. You remember I mentioned Druze people? Usually they spell it like D-R-U-Z, and this is a very special community or very special religion too. Druze people, they started their story in 11th century when they branched from, it was Shia Islam, right? They branched from Shia Islam and they formed their own religion. So they keep this religion in secret, but the first thing they did in 11th century, they declared one of the local rulers in Egypt at that time as a new prophet. So they immediately were recognized as a heretics from Muslim point of view, from the point of view of classical. Not looking for their independence. They have never had the idea of their own land because they moved, they were strangers, right, in every land. They just want to live quietly and they don't mind to live under any type of political control. So they lived here till 1967, until which control? Syrian. It was Syria, part of Syria. We spoke about the situation here in the region this morning. They were taken under Israeli control in 1967 and they didn't move. So from the whole population of the Golan Heights and Mount Hermon that we got from Syria, only 4 Druze villages stayed. All of the rest of the people, Sunni and Shia Muslims, they moved into the Syria, inland Syria, but those 4 Druze villages were left here. And in their tradition, they have very interesting costumes. So now when we are crossing the village, if you see some people with the, like men, they wear very typical and very kind of strange pants. If we'll see some, I'll show to you in front of us. Look at her clothes. So she can read scriptures, religious scriptures, but secular Druze, they have no approach to their religious scriptures. Only religious Druze can read them. And look at this lady on the left hand side, like a long skirt and this type of the white thing that they put on the head, so that's for the women. And hopefully we are going to go into the building with the religious costume. Can you see him?
Yes.
Yeah, look at his pants, very special type of pants.
What?
Yeah, that's
Hammer pants.
traditional religious dress.
Baggy in the middle.
And looking at the events leading up to John 21, those final days with Christ and the disciples. Have you thought about that? I mean, here's this triumphal entry. They thought the king was coming. I mean, the excitement, the enthusiasm, and maybe still trying to ponder what Jesus was doing at Caesarea Philippi. This question to Peter, who do you say I am? And upon Peter's confession, the gates of hell will not prevail, but upon the church. What does this mean? The first word, ecclesia, and all the conversations as Jesus turns his face towards Jerusalem, and Jesus knew what he had to do in obedience. But in those final days, the triumphal entry, and they go and they share a meal, a Passover meal, which turns to be the Last Supper. And going to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, and to then being betrayed by their own. I mean, Judas, who would have thought? Judas, the one they trusted the most, the one who held the money for the team, the disciples, their friend, their companion for 3.5 years, walked with Judas, and Judas gives the kiss. Judas. And then Peter, their leader, tries to take a sword and take off a head, but misses and gets only an ear. Peter, their leader. And they all run, and some even forget their clothes. little section of Mark, if you haven't caught that, leaving his little cloth behind. They scatter, they run, and Peter denies Christ. And their beloved rabbi gets hung and crucified on a criminal's cross. To which he's resurrected. Great joy and great celebration, right? But yet you can imagine the confliction of what's going to happen now. And even processing the death of Judas, the death of Christ, know what that means for them. This new word, ecclesia, the church, what's their role and what's going to happen now, because it's basically Peter's down and out. Let's go back. Let's go fishing.
Down here on the Sea of Galilee at the Church of the Primacy, Church of Peter, believed to be the spot where Jesus in John 21 reinstated Peter, asked him 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And feed my sheep. Fed him breakfast, and reinstated him as the leader after he denied Christ 3 times. Jesus offered him forgiveness and restored him. Wow. Read John 21. Jason getting pictures of the heart rocks.